Hey guys, what's going on? In this video, we'll be learning about lists, tuples, and sets. So by definition, lists and tuples allow you to work with sequential data, whereas sets are a collection of unordered values with no duplicates. So if you didn't understand what I just said, no need to worry, we will understand it much better in this video. So let's start off with the list. Quickly, let me type list. Okay. So as its name suggests, list helps us to work with list of values. So the notation of list is something like this. So create a variable, say name, and you just put a square bracket. So this implies that you have created a variable name of type list. So if I just hover over it, Visual Studio Code will just tell me that the variable that I created is of type list. Okay, so let's populate this with some dummy values. Now, the fact that lists can hold any data type is very unique to Python itself. So if you're coming from many other fields like C, C++, you have to actually declare the type of array, whether it's an integer array or something like that. So in Python, we don't have such things. We can declare a heterogeneous combination, which means we can use the sets, the strings, integers, floats, etc. in the list. So since I just create a name, so I will be populating this with a string value. So let's put name Amy, Dan, Corey, Point. So let's put these names. And so basically what I did is I created a list containing these datas. So I can directly print the list by typing just print name. And if I run it, you see it will just directly print me the list inside the square bracket. So this shows that the value that I got back is a list. Okay, now we can actually find the length of the list by just putting len. Just like in remember in strings we used len. We can just choose len as the variable which has list and just print the value. You will find it's 4 because there are 4 contents inside, or you can say 4 elements inside the list. So the length of the list is the number of values that is contained in the list. Okay, so now let's access individual values. So now to access individual values, we can make use of square brackets. So let's print Amy. So for that we can pass the variable name, square bracket. And in the previous video, as I told you that we access elements via zero indexing. Just like that, in list also we access elements via zero based indexing. So the starting value is assigned at 0 index, and the ending value, in this case we have 4 elements, so 4 minus 1 would be 3 because it's starting from 0, right? So let's print Amy, and if I run it, you see it has accessed the string Amy. And to access the last value, in this case point, I'll just pass the length minus 1. Length is 4 and minus 1 is 3. If I pass it, the answer will be point. So this is how we access individual elements. Now, so what happens is sometimes the list grows and grows and grows, right? So for example, if I want to add several elements like mask, say OLED, and things like that. So if I want to access the last value by default, so there is something called negative indexing. So I can, if I directly pass -1, that means I am starting to access values from the end. So zero based indexing starts values from the beginning. Negative based indexing starts the value from the end. So if I type -1, we can always print the value which is at the last, or access the value which is at the last. There you go, OLED. And if I type -4, what happens is -1 is OLED, -2 is mask, -3 is point, and -4 is Corey. So it should print Corey. I think you got the point of using negative indexing. Now let's what happens if you pass the index which does not exist. For example, here the length is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 is the length. And if you directly pass if you want to access the 7th element, because we are passing in the 6, in this case we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is no 7th element, right? So if I type to print it, it will give me a list index out of range error because there is no index 6 in this list, because the last index is 5, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hence it gave us an error. So that was about accessing individual elements from a list. Now let's access a range of elements from the list. For that, we use something known as slicing. Remember, in strings we also did slicing. So for example, let's suppose we want to access only these three data from the list. For that, let's make use of print function. Let me clear the screen. Okay, so for that, just pass the variable, and we pass a starting index inclusive. That is, we want Corey, point, and mask, right? So we pass the index of Corey, which is 1 2, and we pass the ending index of mask. But it is, if you pass the ending index of mask, if you remember the string lecture, you would find it will only print up to point, because I told you that in case of slicing, the starting index is inclusive and the ending index is exclusive. So you have to put an index plus 1. So here the mask is at index 4, and if I want to access mask as well, I have to pass an index plus 1. So I have to pass 5. So if I try to print it, you would see it will print as mask. So if you want to access Corey, point, mask, and OLED, I have to pass index 6. So OLED is at index 5. If you directly pass index 5 here, it will not include, because the ending value is exclusive, so we need to add plus 1. So if you directly print it, you'll find it access all the values. Now there are some couple of list methods that we can use, so let's understand them pretty quickly. Methods. Okay, so first of all, we have something called append method. So append method is used to add elements to the last. So what we can do is, if we want to add a new person, say Mark, to the last of the list, we can make use of append method. So let's add person to the last, name dot append, and say the person is Mark. And if I try to print the name, you'd see Mark would be appended at the end of the list. The one thing to be noted that we can't pass multiple values, say Mark, Max, and things like that, because append takes only one value. So if I try to run it, you would see it will give me an error, because it says list append takes exactly one argument, but 2 was given. So it takes only one value. Now that was about append. Now there's another method called inserts. Suppose if you want to insert values at a particular position, you can make use of insert method. So insert takes two values. First is index, and the second is the value to be inserted. Suppose I want to insert something at the beginning before Amy. So let's insert something like Pratik at the beginning. So before Amy, I want to insert user Pratik. So I will pass the index of Amy, comma, thing I want to pass. In this case, I would pass Pratik. If I try to print it, you will notice something interesting. So the interesting thing is, the entire list is not overridden. So in this case, the length of the list was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, upon adding Pratik to the 0th index, everything got shifted by one place. So instead of directly overriding Amy with Pratik, what it does, it inserted Pratik at the beginning, and every other values are shifted towards the end. So that was adding values at a particular position. Now, okay, now there is one more method which we can use to append at the last. This method is known as extend method. So what extend method does, it takes a list and appends it at the back. So let's quickly create a new let's say new name. We pass names like Mark, Susan. Now let's append at the last via using extend method. Now extend new name, and if I try to print name, you notice that Mark, Susan, and Shubham are appended at the back. Now one thing you notice here is that how is it different from the append method and insert method. So let's quickly identify the difference between them. So let's do append new name. So you would notice that instead of taking the Mark, Susan, and Shubham and appending at the last, it will mark an entry for the entire list. So if I access the last element, in this case the last element is denoted by -1. So if I try to print it, it will give me a list of Mark, Susan, and Shubham. So if I replace it via extend, you will notice the last is not a list, but is the last element is Shubham, because the list is Amy, Dan, Corey, Point, Mask, Olid, comma, Mark, Susan, Shubham, all individual. Now let's understand the insert method as well. So insert is also the same. So instead of passing the individual elements inside the new name list to name, it will pass the entire list as an element. You can find the entire list is added at the beginning, and then Amy is printed next. So that was about the append, insert, and extend method. Now let's understand another method called remove method. So if you want to remove something, you can make use of the remove method. So if you want to remove, say, Dan from the list, what I can do is we can do something like name dot remove and Dan. So if I try to print name, you would see Dan is removed from the list. There is another method which you can remove, and that is via pop. But pop does not take a value in particular. Pop takes the index of the value you want to remove. So let's suppose we want to remove Dan again. So we can do name.pop, the index is 1, and if I print the name, Dan is again removed. But the difference between remove and pop is that pop returns the value that it removed. So we can catch that value in a variable. So let's say removed value, and we can do name.pop1. Let's quickly want to remove this, and we can print name, and then let's print remove value. If I try to print this, you notice the list has Dan removed, and the removed was Dan. So suppose if I pass some invalid index, so for example, so let's pass 6. Let's see what is the output. It gave us index out of range because, as I told you earlier, the index 6 does not exist. Now if you don't pass any value, what pop does is automatically removes the last value. So in this case, all it was removed, and the removed value was OLED. So that was about pop and remove. So suppose if you want to reverse the list elements, what you can do, you can make use of the reverse method. So name.reverse, and if I try to print the name, the entire list would be in reverse direction. So if I print it, you'd see the list will be printed in reverse direction. So let me actually clear this screen. Okay, now here comes another part. We can also sort the list, and by default this sorts the list in ascending order. So in this case, it will be sorted on the basis of alphabetical order. So run it, you can see the list is sorted on the basis of alphabetical order. Now if you want to reverse the sorting method, so for example in this case it was arranged as per increasing alphabetical order. So if you want to sort the list in decreasing order, what you can do is you can pass parameters, a reverse equals to, and assign it a value true. So in this case, point would be the first value, and it will start sorting in the decreasing order. There you go. Okay, there is one more way through which you can sort the list, that is via sorted method. So you instead of writing name dot sorted, you pass a direct method sorted, and inside you pass the list name. And if I directly print name, you would notice that there are no changes, right? The reason is that sorted does not sort the list in place. It, instead of sorting the name list then and there itself, it returns a new list which is sorted. So we can catch that new list, say sorted list, and we can print that sorted list. So let me print it, and if I run it, you will notice that now it's sorted. So that's the basic difference between sort and sorted. So sorted returns you the new list which is printed, and it does not sort in place, while sort sorts the data in place, and it directly you can access the sorted list. Okay, now let's quickly look at the inbuilt functions of list. So inbuilt functions. Now there is first thing called as min function. So for better understanding, let's make use of the integer list. So let's take age equals to 10, 35, 43, 23, 45, and 65. Now there is something called as min function, so we can return the minimum value from the list. So by passing return min and passing the list, so what min function inbuilt function does, it returns the minimum value from the list. So in this case, age is the minimum value. In the same way, we can also return the maximum value. If I try to return maximum value, it will return 65, since 65 is the maximum value. We can also add all the elements and print the value. So in this case, if I directly pass the sum inbuilt function, what does it adds 10, 35 and the entire elements in the list, and it will print me the value, return me the value. So in this case, the value is 221. So now let's dive into some concepts of lists. Let's come back to the, okay, let me actually go ahead and write the names again. Name equals to Amy. Okay, that's enough. So now let's check whether an element exists in list or not. For that, we make use of in operator. Now, one thing to note is that in operator is returns you true or false if you directly use it in a statement. So if I type print, you pass Dan in name. So what it does is it checks whether the element Dan exists in list name. If it does, it will return true, otherwise it will return false. In this case, it returned me true. If I type Danny in name, which does not exist, it will return me false. The same way we can make use of the integer list like 34 in name. Nope, that is not. So in operator is used to check whether the element that you want is present in the list or not. Okay, we can also use in operator to loop through elements in the list, and sometimes we can use it via conditionals too. So for example, we can use if Amy in name print she is present. What it does is it evaluates this statement, is Amy in name, so it will return me true, and since it is true, I entered the if, so it should print she is present. Let me run it. Okay, she is present. Now that was how I used in operator in conditionals. Now we can use in operator to loop through the list and access them individually as well. So for now, I'll use for loop, and we will be understanding loops further in the videos, in the upcoming videos. Now for to iterate through the values, we can make use of for loop. So type for items in any, so one thing to notice that I can pass any variable, let's say names or items, anything. So I a dummy variable names in name print names. What it does is this variable is what we call an iterator, will iterate through each value and it will access it, and then we can print the value. So if I run it, you can see it iterated through the entire Amy, Dan and Corey, and it printed me these values. The same goes to age as well. So we can pass any dummy variable, say items or ages. In age, we can print ages. If I do that, it will print me all the ages. So for now, don't worry about for loop. Now suppose you want to access the index while you iterate through the loop. For that, we can make use of something called enumerate. So let's type for ages in enumerate, and you pass the list and print ages. Now one thing to notice is that enumerate returns two values, and those values are the index and the element. So here we only used ages, right? So actually it does, it returns a tuple value. So I actually shouldn't mention tuple right now because we'll be covering in the next video, in the upcoming section. It returns the tuple value, and if I print the ages, it will return a tuple of the elements. If I run it, you'll notice it will return me tuple. And to access the individual elements, what you can do, we can do something like index comma ages and print index and ages. So what it does is, Now we are having a returned tuple. The index and ages will represent, index will represent this element and ages will represent this element. So indirectly we should say index will print out these values 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4 so on, and ages will represent the age values. If I try to print it, let me actually clear the screen, ls, and if I try to print it, you notice that now I get a clean output value. Now I can make use of the index variable and I can make use of the ages variable as well inside the for loop. So that was about enumerate. So again, I apologize for introducing the tuples earlier, but I think it was a necessity for list since it needs to be mentioned, and enumerate was such an important function. Okay, now we are having a list, and let's convert this list to a string. So note that this is not applicable to integer list or heterogeneous list, or if you're having a list something like this 10, then we have some string, then we have some variable, then we have some floats. So we can't actually convert these type of heterogeneous list to strings. What we can do is we can directly convert a list of strings to a single string value. So let's convert the name list to a particular string. In order to do that, let's create a variable, say name string, and put a separator there, and I'll come back to what separator is, and put dot and type join and pass the name of the string, name of the list. Let's come back to the separator. So what the join does is it accesses each values inside the list and it converts them to a combined string, right? So when you're combining to a string, you want them to be separated by what? You want to separate it by a hyphen, comma, space. Okay, I'll show you. So let's put space and let's print the value. Print name string. If I try to print it, you can see it will give me a very neat single piece of string with Amy space Dan space Corey. So if I just hover over it, you will see Visual Studio Code says, hey, name string is a string actually. It's not a list because dot join has converted this to a string. Now let's put a hyphen in between. So what this does is it takes each element, puts hyphen in between, and then joins with another element. So what it does is it combines Amy, Dan, Corey elements of the name to a string saying Amy hyphen Dan hyphen Corey. Let's print it. You can see this is a string. So this was how you converted a list to string. Let's convert the string back to a list. Okay, let's take a fresh example actually. So let's take like a sample hello world. This is going to be a list. Okay, we have a sample string right there and we need to convert them to a list. So for that, let's create a variable, a sample list, and you pass the name of the string dot, you pass the split method, and inside split you pass the separator, and in this case the values are separated by a space, so I will pass space. What this does is it is now going to access each element whenever it encounters a space. So first of all, it loops through hello and it encountered a space, which means that hello is the first element in the list, right? It iterates through world and encounters another space, so it will consider word as another element. So let's print sample list. So if I print sample list, you notice that everything is converted to a list. So what if I do something like hello hyphen world, and of course let's put something hyphen here as well, and if I pass separator as hyphen, in this case it will separate on the basis of hyphen. So hello is one element, world this is another element, going to be a list is another element. So let's print it out. There you go. So I think you got the point of using split and converting string back to a list. Okay, so those were a lot to digest in lists. Now let me tell you that once you cover list, the tuples and sets are pretty easy. Let's talk about tuples. So as I told you before, once you know about lists, tuples and sets are really easy. So let's talk about tuples. Let me clear the screen. Okay, so tuples by definition, it's similar to lists, but tuples are immutable. So what I mean by immutable is that once you assign a value to tuples, you can't change it. So that means list is mutable. That means we modified the list elements, right? We appended, we inserted, we removed, we accessed individual elements and changed it. Whenever you can do things like this, we call them as mutable. So list tuples are immutable, meaning you can't do any kind of modification to tuples once you assign it. Let's understand how tuples are represented. And let's create a tuple. So this is a tuple, and if I can pass any variable here, elements inside, and I can also pass strings and things like that, because as I told you, it's a just like list, it can store heterogeneous data. So if I just print it, it won't print me any error because these values are accepted. Now a question arises, why do we use tuples? So if you have data that you want to modify or is pretty dynamic, then go ahead with lists, because you would want to modify in future, right? So, and if you have concrete constants data otherwise, you can make use of tuples, because those data won't be modified. So to show you that tuples are immutable, let me actually create a tuple, say 1 2 3, and let's actually make use of one method that we used in list, which be, let it be append, and let's append a value 4 at the end. If I try to print a, you will see it will throw me an error because append is not an attribute inside tuple, because it doesn't actually allows this kind of method. So if I actually turn it back to a list, let me put this value inside, and now if I try to do this, you would see 4 would be appended at the end. So I think you got the point of difference between mutable and mutable. Immutable means you can't modify once assigned, and mutable means you can modify once assigned, which means you can't use the list methods that we use to modify our list, like append, extend, remove, pop, etc., since list was mutable and tuple is immutable. And otherwise, you can make use of any operations that we did in list in tuples until or unless it modifies the value. So we can access the individual elements of list by using indexes. So we can access the individual values. We can access a range of individual values and things like that. So you can use in operators and things like that in tuples as well, and the things in sets as well. That was all about tuples. The important point of tuple was it's immutable. You can't change the value once it's assigned. Now let's quickly go to sets. Now sets are pretty straightforward, and sets are actually mutable. That means you can make use of all the methods like append, reverse, sort, and things like that with sets as well. Now sets actually is an unordered collection of data, and no duplicates are allowed. So cool. Now let's quickly create a variable, say a equals to, and you denote a set via curly brackets, and you can pass any homogeneous data. I'll tell you what I mean by homogeneous, sorry, any heterogeneous data. I meant heterogeneous data, sorry. And I'll tell you what I mean by unordered data. So if I pass 32, then 2, then if I pass 22 and things like that, just notice the ordering of these in the set. So when I print it, you see the orders are completely changed. Now this time 32 came at first, 32 came at first, then 4 and things like that. So if I run it again, you'd see the orders keep on changing, right? So sets doesn't relatively save the position in which the elements are stored. That's what it meant by unordered. So what do you mean by duplicate? So let's actually pass, so say let's type hello again, Now if I try to print this, you notice that the duplicate data is not at all visible since sets does not allow duplicate data. Cool. Now since the indexes keep on changing in the sets, so there is no concept of indexing. So if I try to access say a of 0, it actually doesn't make sense. See, it doesn't make sense because there is no concept of indexing, because all the values elements keep on changing the relative position. So for that we can't access the values via indexing. So how do we access the values? So as I told you, we can make use of 4 items or any value in A, and we can access the items via a for loop. There you go, it can access entire values. Now let's understand some useful function that we can use with sets. Now the first is intersection. Okay, now let's quickly create another set, say B, which is 2 3 5 5, and if you want to print only those which are present in A and B, so which means we have to print only the common things which are present. So for that we make use of intersect method. So we do A dot intersection actually, then pass another set B. If I try to print it, you'd see it will print 2 and by, because 2 and by is present in A and B as common elements. Now if I want to combine both, I can make use of union. So it will print me a very long list combined, A and B combined, and note that duplicate values are not allowed. So it will print the combination of both. And if I want to find the difference, that means if I want to find elements that are present in A but not in B, I can put A dot difference B, and if I try to print it, it will say, hey, 32, 1, hello, and 22 are present in A but not in B. Okay, so those were all about useful functions in sets. Like I told you before, we can make use of several other functions that we used along with lists with sets as well. Okay, now before we move on, I want to give you some pointers. Now to denote an empty list, we can do either a square bracket or we can do something like a list. Why do we do this is, for suppose we want to declare a variable and we want to initialize the value later, we can initialize the list like empty list like this. Now if we want to initialize the empty tuples, we can do a as square bracket, single round brackets, and we can also do a tuple. This also initializes an empty tuple. Oops, let me do tuple there. Okay, now another is empty set. Now in this case, one thing to note that this is not an empty set. It stands for dictionary, which we will be covering in the next video. So how do you initialize an empty set? So you initialize an empty set by typing set. Alright, so this marks the end of the video. So this was a hell lot of a journey. I know this video is long because I think this was a really important part of the data types of Python. And I hope you really enjoyed this video. And if you really like this video, you can actually contribute. And the easiest one is to simply like and subscribe the channel. And you can also spread the word to others who really want to learn Python by sending them the links and sharing these videos. And I see you on the next video. Alright, see you guys.